Let me just share a few highlights of what I've seen just in the press in the last few weeks. Obama administration again underestimates Islamic State as Afghan affiliate grows into threat. D.C. transit police officer charged with aiding ISIS. ISIS increasingly using women and children to terrorize France. 5 U.S. troops wounded in combat with ISIS in Afghanistan. Vladimir Putin's rumblings raise new fears in Ukraine conflict. Russia holds biggest military drill yet in Crimea. Iran escalates high seas harassment of U.S. Navy. Iran threatens to destroy Israel with 100,000 missiles. North Korea conducts 5th nuclear test. It's made warheads with higher strike power. South Korea prepares for worst-case scenario with North Korea. Mr. President, these are just a few samples of headlines in the last few weeks alone. What we see right now going on in the United States Senate is gridlock, the gridlock that is creating the backlash that we see in the presidential race right now. People back home know Washington is dysfunctional. It's not working. But right now we have a situation where the Democrats are blocking these defense appropriations, and yet again the Senate is re-entered this session of this period of dysfunction. The world is more dangerous than it's been at any time in my lifetime, Mr. President. And I'm a product of the nuclear age, the Cold War. I grew up in a military town where at one point we had B-52s there. And I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis where KC-135s, B-52s, C-141s were all flying out of there in support of the blockade over Cuba. And yet today, I believe that the world is more dangerous than it's ever been. Right now, we face a global security crisis. I believe it's on several levels. First, the rise of aggressiveness in Russia and China, partly caused by our own intransigence, by creating power vacuums around the world and encouraging misbehavior. Second, I believe right now ISIS is a product of our own creation in many ways. The early removal of our troops in Iraq created a vacuum into which ISIS has grown. They needed territory to validate their caliphate, and they got that. We now face nuclear proliferation in Iran and North Korea. We have a cyber war going on right now today. I personally believe we've been invaded, which means we are at war today by nation states around the world. 2 brigades right now are being stood up in my home state in Augusta, Georgia, Fort Gordon. 2 cyber warrior brigades are being stood up right now. 2 of 31 brigades in our United States Army. I'm proud of those people. They're going to stand up to this threat, but it's real. And lastly, we have a race, an arms race in space that nobody's talking about. Mr. President, in my lifetime, I've never seen the symmetric threats and the asymmetric threats that we face in our country today. Ensuring that our men and women in uniform, those protecting this freedom, our freedom, around the world, should never be open to political games. Least of all now in the face of all these myriad threats. But Senate Democrats in this body don't feel that way, obviously. Since I came to the United States Senate, the members of our colleagues across the aisle, many friends, have blocked funding for our military 6 times. 6 times, Mr. President, in my tenure here alone, Democratic members of this body have put their partisan games before funding and the support of our troops. And that's after the appropriation, because you just heard, 30-0. 14 Democrats, 16 Republicans got together, got in a room, argued the differences out, and came to a bipartisan. Isn't that what we were sent here to do? And that's what they did. They passed this bill in committee. There's no debate here. Everybody in this body wants this bill. But I just don't understand why they now are holding it hostage for other political games, partisan political games that they're playing right now. Mr. President, this is one of only 6 reasons why 13 colonies came together in the first place, was to provide for the national defense. Yet some 200 years later, in the midst of a global security crisis, Congress can't even get that done. We can't fund our government and fund our military without drama. And what message does this send to our men and women in uniform around the world? Can you imagine? They can't even depend on us here in this body to fund the needs that they have every day. This is a total breakdown in the system. Democrats are endangering our men and women in uniform, and they're not doing their job. I'm outraged by this, Mr. President. Georgians back home are outraged. People around the country are outraged by this. Is anyone surprised that less than 20% of Americans trust the federal government? I'm not surprised at all. As I've said before, Democrats claim they want to support our military. They tell us all their heart-wrenching stories. Some of them have children in uniform, Mr. President. They call for action. And yet they're the ones blocking this bill and blocking us from debating this on the floor of the United States Senate. I don't understand that. At a time when we should be united in the face of global threats, the brinksmanship and gridlock permeating in this body is quite simply disgraceful. America must lead again. It must lead in the world. I've traveled the world a lot, as you have, Mr. President, in the last year and a half. And the number one request I get from heads of state that we all get to talk with is America needs to lead again. They're not asking us to be the policeman anymore. They just need us to lead to common solutions against these same threats that threaten their countries just like they threaten ours. We've got to lead again, but to do that, we've got to have a strong foreign policy. To have a strong foreign policy, we have to have a strong defense. And to have a strong defense, we have to have a strong economy. We know about the debt crisis. We can't fix our military. We can't recap our military without having a strong economy and solving this debt crisis. One of the biggest complaints I hear when we're doing continuing resolutions, and that's what we do when we don't do our jobs, by the way, is it really hurts the military's ability to plan and to train. They can't look forward. They're so worried about getting funded today. And I've seen those shortfalls around the world, Mr. President, as you have. That's what it's come to. My colleagues across the aisle believe that their political gain in this presidential election season is more important than our men and women in uniform and more important than protecting our country. This is not a partisan comment. This is fact. I'm an outsider to this process, and I have to tell you, I feel the same outrage that the people back home feel. We can no longer take our security for granted, we can no longer take our military for granted, and we can no longer take our men and women in uniform for granted. Mr. President, I firmly believe our founders would be outraged by what's going on right now. Senator William Few was the very first person in 1789 that stood in my seat right here in the Senate room just down the hall. William Few, as ironically as it is, a direct descendant of his was on my staff when I ran for this office. But I think that man would be absolutely apoplectic about us not funding our military. Can you imagine somebody that put their life on the line back then, looking at what we're doing right now, the nonsense that we have going on? The stakes are too high for this nonsense to continue. Democrats must drop this obstructionism. It's time for Washington to fund our military, pass the Defense Appropriation Bill, and move on to fund our government.